Hi folks, welcome to the first substantive lecture of this semester. This one will cover the introduction chapter to Machine Platform Crowd. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the concepts that will be used in the book as kind of an overview for the semester. I hope that you all enjoyed the quiz. It wasn't too bad, I hope, but if you were able to do the reading, then everything worked out okay. Just a reminder again that the quizzes are open book, open note, but you do have to do them, or I ask you to do them at least before you do the rest of the work for the semester. So you're for the week rather. So you're not able to access the lectures or anything like that until after you've done the reading and the reading quiz. So let's get into the lecture. As I mentioned, this one's going to cover the first chapter, that introduction chapter. So we'll start by defining the domain, and when I say the domain, I mean what are the definitions of machine, platform, and crowd. So when we talk about machines, some of the terms that I've used to describe this in the past are machine intelligence or artificial intelligence. But we're talking about the rapidly increasing and expanding capabilities of machines, computers, when we say machines. When we talk about platforms, we're talking about large and influential, generally young companies that are very different from the kinds of companies that have existed in the past, but are very disruptive. And so I'll get into more detail in a minute, but things like Uber and eBay and Amazon to a certain extent, the Apple iTunes Store, these things are asset light. They're, we'll get into a little bit more detail about what platforms look like in a minute. Then finally, crowd. And the crowd is all of the resources that exist in a distributed sense all across the world. So you have people and resources and knowledge and expertise that are all distributed, right? Each person has a little bit of knowledge and a little bit of resources, a little bit of money, and part of what we're able to do in these businesses and in these organizations is harness the power of all of this distributed resources and sort of channel them toward one organizational goal. Let's go into these things in a little bit more detail. So the example from the machine unit is from the game Go. And what Brynjolfsson and McAfee say is that Go is an absurdly complicated game. And one of the things that is unique about Go is that it reflects this paradox called Polanyi's paradox. And that suggests that we know more than we can tell. And there's a good example of it in the book about how the ordering of the adjectives that we use to describe things. We know kind of as English speakers, especially native English speakers, that there's a certain order of the adjectives when we try to describe words, describe something. And if you mess with that ordering a little bit, and there's no sort of written rule that we can necessarily think of, but if we mess with that rule, things sound a little bit weird. And how do we know what that rule is? Well, it's what we would call tacit knowledge. It's things that we kind of know, but we have trouble writing down or putting into words, which are things that we call explicit knowledge. And this part of the chapter that talks about machine intelligence uses the example of AlphaGo, which is an algorithm. It's a machine learning algorithm that plays Go, the game. And the thing that's important to note, and we'll get into this in much more detail when we go into the machine module, the chapters 2 through 5, is that AlphaGo is not programmed with strategies and heuristics and rules. Instead, it relied on a deep learning system that could learn on its own. So the idea is that these kinds of systems that are based on sort of a complex list of rules and scenarios are less effective today than these machine learning systems that do sort of training or neural networks or self-learning, deep learning kinds of systems. And that's this last point here on the slide that says that there's this distinction between rule-based systems and pattern recognition systems, and it's the latter, the pattern recognition systems, that are really starting to take over in terms of effectiveness today. So when we talk about platforms, we're talking about a lot of different examples of companies. So Uber, the world's largest taxi company, owns no vehicles. Facebook, the world's largest, popular media owner, doesn't create much, if any, content on their own. Instead, the users create content. Alibaba, the world's most valuable retailer, has no inventory. Instead, they have a network of sellers that buy that sell goods to users that also use the platform, right? Airbnb, the world's largest accommodation provider, owns no real estate. So the argument that the book makes is that there's no better business to be in than the platform business, because you don't have all of these capital expenses of cars or hotels or property or content creation experts, people that make videos or what have you, right? YouTube is another example of one of these, right? YouTube does create, I think, a little bit of content, and now that they have YouTube Red, I think is maybe part of their content creation network. But by and large, YouTube's content is created by all of these other content creators who exist on the platform. And so the platform caters to the content creators on the sort of production side, and it also caters to users who want to stream videos on the consumption side. So YouTube is the platform, and they have production and consumption that they try to incentivize on both sides. So the thing about platforms is that growing platforms is very difficult because there's a chicken or egg problem. If I'm trying to start a new YouTube, I need to incentivize content creators to join my platform, and I also need to incentivize content consumers to join my platform. And it's hard to get the one without the other, and it's hard to get the other without the one, right? So that's this chicken or egg problem that platforms have when they're trying to grow new platforms, or you're trying to start a new platform in a space where there might already be a platform. And the third one, crowd, right? Machine Platform Crowd is the title of the book. This is the third major module of the book, is the crowd. So new participants and practices that are enabled by the internet and attendant technologies. Like I said before, they exist in a distributed sense, but these technologies and the internet allow organizations to channel the crowd and get expertise or money or whatever other kinds of resources that it wants from the crowd. And the example here is GE. And GE, which is, at the time, a $280 billion company with $90 billion in cash on hand, is asking potential customers to commit, a couple $100 to pre-order this ice maker well in advance of the product's availability. Now, when you think about crowdfunding, Kickstarter and whatnot, you generally think that the reason that these, startup businesses use this crowdfunding model is to gain funding so that they can then pool the financial resources of everybody in the crowd and then manufacture or produce whatever the thing is that they want to produce and then send it to everybody who paid for it. That's not really what's happening with GE here with this ice machine, right? Because they have $90 billion in cash on hand, and you'd think that they have enough money to develop this ice machine. However, what they want from here is not necessarily the financial resources, but they want enthusiasm, they want expertise, and they want all of these other sort of intangible, non-financial resources that they can leverage by setting up this pre-order process for this pellet ice machine. So how do you take advantage of the crowd? Labor, information, money, of course, and other resources as well. So that'll be the third main module that we'll go through in the first half of the semester. So what is the triple revolution of machine, platform, and crowd? It's thinking about how these three different things are changing modern businesses. So new combinations of mind and machine. So minds are sort of the old school, machines kind of the new school, are changing business processes. Platforms are transforming the service offering of firms. And then finally, the core and the crowd are altering what organizations themselves look like, right? Organizations no longer need to organize themselves in the same way that they did now that they have access to some of these pools of resources using the internet. And that's kind of the lesson from this book, is you'll see how this happens in a lot of different case settings. And the idea then is that you'll take this context into the next book, when we talk about IT strategy and what things you as a non-IT manager might need to do to make your business in your competitive environment operate more efficiently and more effectively. So, again, similarly to the idea that there's a triple revolution, within that there's three rebalancings that are happening. And so, for machine intelligence, the counterpart that's being rebalanced is the human mind. For the platform, the counterpart that's being rebalanced is the product, and for the crowd, the counterpart that's being rebalanced is the core. So the thing that's important to note, the caveat, is that minds, products, and the core do not become obsolete, but the question is how do we work together with these new kinds of systems to create business models, business processes that are even more efficient and more effective than what we've been doing in the past. So when we say rebalancing, we're very explicit about that. It's a rebalancing between mind and machine, between product and platform, and between the core and the crowd. So there's a couple of other things that Brynjolfsson and McAfee talk about before they conclude. And the first is, why is this happening now? And to answer this question, they point to one of their older books. So they wrote a book called The Second Machine Age. I think that was immediately before this one. And before the Second Machine Age, there was another book called Race Against the Machine. So if you like this book, if you're enjoying it, I think that The Second Machine Age is a good recommendation for if you're interested in sort of continuing with this set of ideas. Of course, The Second Machine Age was written before this book. This book is a 2017 book. But there's two phases to the second machine age, they say, in this book. Phase one began in the mid-90s when you had the beginning of the digital revolution, right? So in that phase, you took routine work and you started to automate it. So things like payroll and things like sending invoices to customers and things that happened the same way, week after week or day after day in a routine sense. Phase 2 happens in 2010 when we start to move into non-routine tasks, non-routine processes, right? So automated cars is a good example of this. The act of driving a car is the furthest possible thing from a routine experience because there's all of these different kind of exception conditions, we can call them, that pop up that you have to react to. Like, for example, if a car is slowing down in front of you, you need to know how to react to that exception condition and realize that it's not a routine that you can just program in and have it do week after week after week. So what's different about the second phase? Not the idea that there's non-routine tasks. We have more processing and connectivity than we ever have, especially compared to the mid-90s. For those of you that had internet access, early dial-up internet access, that the extent to which connectivity has increased on both a consumer and an enterprise level since then is mind-blowing. And then the third thing is that this idea that information is no longer encoded in molecules, right? If we think about a piece of information, maybe a sentence written on a piece of paper, that paper is encoded, so to speak, in molecules. It is a physical thing that you can move around. But now a lot of our information is encoded in bits, and bits are these digital units, like they're binary units, right? And they are either ones or zeros, and then they can be transmitted over, digital networks. And digital information goods, information encoded in bits, has a bunch of different properties from information encoded in molecules. Like you can replicate them much easier. Different people can use them at the same time. There's all of these properties of information goods that we'll get into, I think, next week. What's another sort of kind of concluding point that Brynjolfsson and McAfee talk about is what happened last time, right? What happened to some of these companies like Nokia, for example, and why aren't we able to predict some of these things very well? And so this is what they call the curse of knowledge, and specifically a bias that we have toward the status quo. And this is a sort of a cognitive bias that we're all kind of confronted with, or that we all face. And it's very difficult for us to see things outside of how they kind of relate to the status quo. The status quo means like the world of today. And so you see these companies like, I think the example from the book is that Nokia, when back in the day of the brick phone, right? These things were everywhere. They were the most common, the most popular phone that everybody had. And Nokia sort of rested on their laurels a little bit. They didn't realize the threat that was coming from Apple. Apple was not a phone manufacturer before the iPhone, right? But before these smartphones started to take off, Nokia thought that they were kind of the king of the cell phone world, and they didn't really invest in, building their own smartphone or any kind of defensive technologies to protect their market share from these smartphones. And what is Nokia today? Nothing like what they were back then, right? They had experimented with some fitness technologies and who even knows what else? But they do not have the market share that they did back in the days of the flip phone. And the reason for that is their status quo bias, their curse of knowledge. The last thing that I want to conclude with is this idea of the universal machine. So when we talk about the universal machine, we're thinking about machines that can learn. They can learn in a variety of settings. And this really enables technologies like automated cars. And so one of the things that Brynjolfsson and McAfee talk about are they do some foreshadowing work to show you that we're in the early stages of another big industrial shakeup, but it's going to be even bigger and broader than the one that we had in the 90s. And one example of this might be autonomous trucks and the trucking industry. And so this picture here is a picture of one of the Tesla trucks. I have, I think, an optional reading about Tesla and some of the troubles that they're having. So we'll see whether or not these Tesla trucks end up coming to market. But the thing about trucking that's very interesting that I don't think we realize is that trucking is a very common industry in the United States. In fact, this is a chart from an NPR, I think, Planet Money story about the most common job in each state from 1978 to 2014. And I have the URL to the actual story in the slide notes, which you can download. But this static slide shows just 2014. And you can see that in all of these kind of teal-green states, the most common job is truck driver. And so if we get into a world where some of this work is automated, right? This trucking work is automated. What happens to all of these jobs? So that's what I kind of want to leave you with for the first week, is that there's a lot of societal implications to these changes. This is the most common job in each state. It's possible that the way that the evolution of autonomous trucking may start with convoys, right? So there's one human-driven truck at the front of a convoy and maybe 3 or 4 autonomous trucks behind it. And the idea then is to make that non-routine work a little bit more routine by having these trucks kind of move in a relatively, consistent fashion. But what does that do? That eliminates 80% of the jobs or 60% of the jobs of truck drivers. And then ultimately, within 5, 10, 15, 20 years, these things will be fully automated. And what happens to all of these jobs when that happens, right? What will these people do? How do they make money? How do they feed their families? How do they get health care, right? All of these things are societal implications of employment that will be disrupted as some of these machine intelligence technologies start to become more ubiquitous in terms of these kinds of applications. So that's what I want to leave you with. That's just the end of our first week. It's a brief overview of the material from the introduction of Machine Platform Crowd. For next week, you'll read chapters 2 through 5, which is all of the machine chapters. And you'll take a quiz again before you can access the lecture. And then I'll have you do a discussion board, and that will be a graded discussion board post. And then finally, your first reverse case analysis. So if you have any questions, feel free to email me directly or post them on our discussion board, and I will do my best to get back to you as soon as I can. I hope you're looking forward to a fun semester, and I will see you on the discussion boards next week.